The city was alive with noise, but nobody seemed to notice the man sitting quietly at the edge of the sidewalk. His clothes were torn, his shoes barely holding together, and his face carried the weary look of someone who had been ignored one too many times. People passed by in a hurry, some with coffee in hand, others glued to their phones, and no one stopped to think that maybe the man they were avoiding had a story worth listening to. That man's name was Daniel. To the world, he looked broke, forgotten, invisible. But behind the disguise, Daniel was one of the wealthiest men in the country. A billionaire whose name appeared in magazines, whose company logo stood tall across skyscrapers, whose life was usually filled with board meetings, luxury cars, and private jets. Yet here he was, reduced to nothing more than a shadow on the street. For years, Daniel had wondered whether people treated him with respect because of who he was, or because of what he had. He had friends, yes, but he often asked himself, would they still care if I lost it all tomorrow? The question haunted him, so he decided to step into a world completely opposite of his own. For 1 week, he would strip himself of wealth, wear the life of someone who had nothing, and see humanity from the other side. The morning of his experiment began in silence. In his penthouse, a team of makeup artists worked carefully, adding dirt to his skin, creating dark circles beneath his eyes, and transforming his clean-shaven jaw into a rough beard. His designer haircut was buried beneath a messy cap. When he looked in the mirror, even he could barely recognize himself. No Rolex on his wrist, no tailored suit, just second-hand clothes that smelled faintly of dust. Daniel left his mansion behind, handing the keys of his sports car to his assistant. He kept only $5 in his pocket and a small backpack with nothing but a water bottle. As he closed the heavy gate behind him, he whispered, "For the next 7 days, Daniel the billionaire doesn't exist. Today I'm just nobody." The first step onto the city street felt strange. Normally, drivers waved him through traffic, restaurant owners greeted him with smiles, and strangers recognized him instantly. Now, people brushed past him as if he were invisible. He sat at the corner of a busy intersection, hoping someone might glance his way, but eyes kept shifting away. A businessman bumped into his shoulder without apology. A group of teenagers laughed as they passed, not at him, but the sound still stung. By noon, hunger started gnawing at him. He walked into a small cafe, holding his $5 tightly, scanning the menu. A single sandwich cost nearly the entire amount. He approached the counter hesitantly, his voice softer than usual. "Excuse me, do you have anything, maybe cheaper?" The cashier glanced at his clothes, frowned, and replied, "If you don't have enough, maybe you should try somewhere else." Daniel nodded, thanked her anyway, and stepped outside. On the corner, an older woman selling fruit noticed his hesitation. She smiled gently and handed him a bruised apple. "Here," she said, "no charge." Daniel's chest tightened. He had been rejected just minutes ago, yet this woman, who clearly didn't have much herself, had shown kindness without asking for anything in return. "Thank you," he whispered, taking the apple as if it were gold. That night, Daniel searched for a place to sleep. The shelters were full. The park benches were cold and unwelcoming. He found a spot near a closed bookstore, curled up with his backpack as a pillow, and listened to the distant hum of cars. His body ached, but more than that, his pride stung. He was used to silk sheets, not concrete floors. By the second day, Daniel tried to find work. He walked into a small diner and asked if they needed help cleaning tables. The manager looked him up and down and shook his head. "We're not hiring." At a construction site, a foreman barely let him finish speaking before waving him off. "No experience, no job. Move along." Each rejection hit harder than the last. It wasn't his resume, his intelligence, or his ability. It was simply the way he looked. As the hours dragged on, Daniel began talking with others who were truly living the life he was only pretending to endure. A man named Carlos, who had been on the streets for 2 years after losing his job, shared half a sandwich with him. A young woman named Mia, carrying a small child, told him about the struggle of trying to keep her daughter safe at night. Their stories humbled him. He realized that while he could return to his world of wealth whenever he wanted, these people had no such escape. On the third evening, A boy no older than 10 approached Daniel with a single-dollar bill. "Here, mister," the boy said shyly. "You look like you need this more than me." Daniel's throat tightened. The boy's shoes had holes, his shirt was faded, and yet he still gave away what little he had. Daniel had donated millions in his life, but no act of generosity had ever struck him so deeply. By the fourth day, exhaustion had carved lines into his face. His stomach growled constantly. Yet amidst the struggle, moments of kindness kept appearing. A young couple invited him to share a slice of pizza. A bus driver let him ride for free. Small gestures, but in his weakened state, they felt monumental. When the week came to an end, Daniel knew it was time to reveal the truth. He returned home, showered, shaved, and dressed in his usual crisp suit. The billionaire was back, but his heart was changed. The next morning, he went out in his luxury car, searching for the very people who had shown him kindness when he had nothing. He found the fruit seller first. Approaching her stall, he smiled warmly. "Do you remember me?" She tilted her head, unsure. He reached into his jacket and handed her a check. Her hands trembled as she read the number, a sum large enough to change her entire life. "Why?" she whispered, tears filling her eyes. Daniel replied softly, "Because when I had nothing, you gave me something." Next, he visited the boy who had given him the dollar. Daniel knelt down and handed the boy a brand new backpack filled with school supplies and an envelope for his family. The boy's mother opened it, her eyes widening at the sight of a scholarship fund and financial support. "We can never repay you," she said. Daniel shook his head. "It's me who could never repay your son's kindness." Finally, he found Carlos and Mia. For Carlos, Daniel offered a job at one of his companies and a place to stay. For Mia and her child, he arranged an apartment fully paid for, with food and support for as long as they needed. Both of them broke down in gratitude, hugging him tightly. As Daniel stood there, surrounded by the people who had once seen him as nothing more than a stranger in need, he realized something profound. True wealth wasn't in the towers he owned or the cars he drove. It was in the moments of compassion, the small acts of humanity that cost nothing but meant everything. Daniel walked back to his car, but for the first time in years, the leather seats and polished wood trim felt out of place. Luxury didn't comfort him the way it used to. He thought of the bench where he had slept, the sound of Mia's child crying softly in the night, the roughness in Carlos's voice when he spoke about being invisible to the world. Money could erase his hunger, but it could never erase the memory of that cold ground pressing against his back. Later that afternoon, Daniel sat in his office at the top of the city skyline. The view stretched endlessly, but he didn't see the buildings. He saw faces of the people who had shown him kindness. His assistant entered with a stack of reports. "Sir, the board is ready for your call." Daniel nodded absently, but his thoughts drifted elsewhere. What use was a billion-dollar company if people outside its doors were starving? The next day, Daniel returned to the streets, not in disguise this time, but as himself. A black car pulled up near the same intersection where he had once begged for food. Passers-by stopped, curious to see who was stepping out. Cameras clicked, whispers spread, but Daniel ignored them. He carried a small bundle of envelopes, each one sealed with promises of change. He spotted Carlos leaning against a wall, his eyes weary as always. Daniel approached and Carlos squinted, unsure. "Do I know you?" he asked cautiously. Daniel smiled. "Yes, though I didn't look like this the last time you saw me." Carlos frowned, confused. "Wait, you're that guy? On the corner? The one with nothing?" Daniel nodded slowly. "That was me. I wasn't honest about who I was. I needed to understand life from your side." Carlos blinked, speechless. Daniel handed him an envelope. Inside was a job offer letter and the keys to a small apartment. Carlos's hands shook. This can't be real." Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's real. And it's yours. You showed me kindness when the world looked away. You shared your food with a stranger. Now it's my turn to share with you." Carlos's eyes welled up, and for the first time in years he allowed himself to hope. A few blocks away, Daniel found Mia sitting on the steps of a church, her daughter asleep in her lap. When she saw him, her body tensed, unsure whether to trust the stranger in the expensive suit. Daniel knelt down to meet her eyes. "You told me your story. You trusted me when you had no reason to. I want to give something back." He placed an envelope in her hands. She opened it slowly and her breath caught. The envelope contained a lease agreement for a safe apartment, a fund to support her child's education, and a monthly stipend to cover expenses. Mia broke down in tears, clutching her daughter tightly. "Why would you do this?" she whispered. Daniel's eyes softened. "Because you reminded me of what really matters: family, love, survival. And no one deserves to fight alone." The little girl stirred awake and looked up at him with innocent eyes. She didn't understand contracts or money, but she understood warmth. She reached out a tiny hand and Daniel gently held it, feeling the weight of responsibility more than ever. As news of his actions began to spread, people online debated whether his experiment was genuine or just a publicity stunt. Some criticized him, saying he could never truly understand poverty in a week. Others defended him, praising his willingness to step into another world. Daniel read the comments but didn't answer. He knew the truth. Nothing about those nights had been fake. The cold, the rejection, the hunger, they had been real enough to change him. On the 5th day after his return, Daniel went back to the fruit cellar. She gasped when she saw him step out of the sleek car, realizing he wasn't the man she had once given an apple to. He smiled warmly and handed her a check, enough to buy a proper home and expand her small stall into a full grocery shop. She pressed her hands to her mouth, shaking her head. "I only gave you an apple," she stammered. Daniel chuckled softly. "And it was the best apple I've ever eaten." He spent the following week revisiting others who had brushed against his experiment. The bus driver who let him ride free received a gift card worth a year's salary. The young couple who shared pizza with him found themselves invited to a surprise dinner where he covered their student loans. And the boy who had given him $1? Daniel not only funded his education, but also set up a trust for his family. The boy's mother wept openly, unable to believe that one small act of generosity had turned into something so immense. Each gesture was met with disbelief, tears, and gratitude. Yet for Daniel, the most powerful part wasn't the giving, it was the remembering. Remembering the way people looked away when he was in disguise, the sting of rejection, the quiet dignity of those who lived with so little. He realized that he had been living in a bubble his entire life. Wealth had shielded him from truths that millions faced daily. One evening, Daniel sat alone on his balcony overlooking the glittering lights of the city. The skyline sparkled like jewels, but his thoughts lingered on the shadows between those lights. The alleys, the shelters, the hidden struggles. He whispered to himself, "All this means nothing if I can't use it for something greater." The next morning, Daniel called a meeting with his board of directors. They gathered around the long table, papers and laptops ready. Daniel cleared his throat. "For years we've measured success by numbers, profits, margins, growth. But I've seen a side of this city that doesn't show up on our spreadsheets. People are suffering. People who work just as hard, if not harder than we do, and yet they're invisible to us." The directors exchanged puzzled looks. One finally asked, "Sir, what are you proposing?" Daniel leaned forward, his voice firm. "I want to dedicate a portion of our annual profits to housing projects, job training programs, and education for underprivileged families. Not charity, opportunity, real, lasting opportunity." The room fell silent. Some resisted, arguing about shareholder expectations, but Daniel raised a hand. "If shareholders want profit without purpose, they can sell their stock. This company will stand for something more than wealth." His convictions silenced the room. Slowly, one by one, the directors nodded. Over the following months, Daniel's initiative transformed from a bold idea into a real movement. Shelters were renovated, training centers opened, and scholarships were awarded. His story spread beyond the city, inspiring other business leaders to rethink what it meant to succeed. But despite the headlines, Daniel remained grounded. He often returned quietly to the streets, not with cameras or press, but simply to talk, to listen, to remember. Sometimes he would sit on the same bench where he had once shivered, watching people hurry past and think about how close the line was between fortune and misfortune. He kept a single memento from his experiment, a faded dollar bill, the one the boy had given him. Framed on his office wall, it reminded him daily that wealth wasn't measured in digits, but in heart. Years later, when asked in an interview what had changed him most, Daniel smiled softly and said, "For 1 week I lost everything, and in losing it, I found what I had been missing all along."